Danny, Juneau. Wow. Um, I don't know what you're doing in Alaska. Baton Rouge, Florida. Something just went by with Moxie on it. Alexandria, Minnesota. Hey, Nancy. How are you? Alexandra, not Alexandria. Hey, Virginia. How are you? Chattanooga. Chattanooga's a really cool town. Tampa, Portland, Oregon. I'm going to be there in the fall. I just signed a whole bunch of book plates for them. Um, Parkland, Florida. We always think about you. Charlotte, North Carolina, Brooklyn. So let me just start while people file in. Why don't I start with the easy questions? The map behind me is of Muscongas Bay, which is where I'm from. And it is because, as you know, I don't have decent internet at my home. And so somebody lets me use this place. But if you could see it, you would see that it's there really isn't a surface in front of which I could record. So this is like there's a staircase up above me, and this is the only wall in the whole place that I could broadcast against. And somebody took a look at it and said, you can't broadcast with that color behind you and nothing else. So I ran quick as a bunny down to the local gift shop and got a chart, which actually happens to match the rest of the wall. So that's why I'm now sitting in front of this chart. Although you can see it's crooked, I was in a real hurry to put it up. That's one of the things I'll have to deal with. All right, so that one was easy to answer. And we have enough people here that it seems like it's worth starting. And what I am going to do today is scare the pants off you, and then I hope reassure you. So let's start with the question that everybody's asking. And it was asked of me today, framed as, why are the Democrats freaking out about the candidacy of President Joe Biden? And I'm not sure that's the right way to frame it. With the reason is that the Democrats, it's not a secret that Joe Biden is old, right? And that was absolutely on the table during the primaries and during the early caucuses. And the issue at hand, remember, although we tend to look at those of us who are not in the political game, tend to look at presidencies and candidacies as sort of like TV, like it's all for show, and your guy's supposed to look good, or your female candidate is supposed to be talking to the right people, and remember how much crap there was about Hillary Clinton's pantsuits, and it's very much a spectacle, which, by the way, comes from the Eisenhower administration. I'm sorry, the Eisenhower candidacy of 1952, when they had just gotten television. And if you're interested, you can actually look. They did have TV cameras at the 1948 Republican presidential nomination, the Republican National Committee and the convention. And it's kind of fun to pull them up on YouTube because they're horrible. I mean, they're literally a bunch of guys in white dress shirts and black pants talking to each other. And by 52, Eisenhower's people had recognized that they could use television to create enthusiasm for their candidates. So if you might remember the pictures of Eisenhower and his motorcade and the ticker tape parade and all that, they were very deliberately reaching back to the parades after World War II to whip up enthusiasm for Eisenhower. And that didn't really catch on in a huge way. In 1960, we still had debates and stuff. If you think about the Nixon-Kennedy debates, and again, these are all on YouTube if you're interested, and they're not long. You will notice that Kennedy and Nixon talk about the committees they sit on, their experience. They're very sort of wonky debates that are going on in that 1960 Nixon-Kennedy debate. And what happened, of course, was that while many people thought that Nixon had won on the merits, he had he presented very poorly. So if you look at those on YouTube, you will see, if you watch, they've been colorized. So if you watch them in color, at least as when I did it, I'm like, I don't understand why Nixon looks so bad. He looks fine to me. But if you put it in black and white, you can see he blends into the wallpaper behind him. It's really dramatic, the difference between color and black and white make. And so Nixon refused to do another debate. And instead we get, in 1968, this idea, quite deliberate, by the way. And Roger Ailes, who later went on to start Fox News, or to be the CEO of the Fox News channel, was part of Nixon's campaign. And he said, we can just appeal to voters' emotions. We don't actually have to make arguments. That's boring. Instead, we can just do spectacle. So if you're interested, you can go to YouTube and you can see the Nixon ads from 1968 that are, they show pictures of chaos and all kinds of stuff. And then there's this this American flag that is sort of flapping in the distance, and it says, vote like your whole world depended on it. And so we get this idea now. I mean, it's gotten worse or more and more extreme since then. We get this idea that it's all about spectacle, that it's who looks better. But the reality is that in order to win a presidential election, you've got to nail together the most voters, which is one of the reasons that the Republicans since 1986 have worked very hard to try and keep people from voting. They've tried to get rid of voters on the rolls. They've thrown people off. They've now tried to get rid of drop boxes. They've tried to get rid of same-day registration. They've tried to make it harder for people to vote because they know that when people vote, the Democrats win. So the Democrats are trying always to get people to vote and get people to turn out and say, make your voices heard, because they recognize that that's part of their coalition. So to go back to Biden and Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, they pull together a coalition that matches today's demographics in a way that nobody else did. So in addition to the fact that the president and vice president have an extraordinarily successful record, one that really compares to LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson from the 1960s, or even FDR in the 1930s, they've completely reoriented our economy and our foreign affairs. Aside from that, they also are able to get the coalition together that other people couldn't in this demographic. Now, that demographic is going to change by 2028. And it's going to be a whole different kettle of fish. But in this period, the Democrats felt that, and mind you, I'm looking at this as a historian who studies politics. I'm not advocating some people are writing me all kinds of hate mail. And I'm like, listen, I got nothing to do with this. I'm telling you what somebody trained like I do sees. They had the opportunity by putting those two together. And remember, in 2020, there were about 20 people running for the Democrats for the presidency, and it ended up being Biden and Harris, because Biden and Harris provide both the ties to the past with Biden and the ties to the future with Harris. And they put together a certain percentage of the older white vote. Now, really, since 1965, white Americans have voted for Republicans. That's a very dramatic shift in that period, and it's never been changed. But they also pick up the vast majority of the Black vote, which makes up the base of the Democratic Party, the Latino vote, and young people. And, I often hear people say, what has Kamala Harris done? We don't see anything she's done. She's done a lot, but she is also extraordinarily popular among young people. So is Biden, by the way. I mean, people keep reaching out to me and saying, how do we get young people on board for Biden? They are, actually. So I'm not sure it's the Democrats who are freaking out, in part because they want to be on a winning team. Again, think this through. If you are a young Democrat who wants to run for office and have a career in the Democratic Party, you want your party to succeed. And if that means waiting 2 years or 4 years, you're probably willing to do that. And I can talk about the Republicans if you're interested in that as well. Somebody also just put in there, not to forget AAPI voters, Asian American Pacific Islander voters, who also support Harris and Biden. Absolutely true. And I'm not trying to denigrate anybody, but simply saying that there is a coalition that these people could put together. But what you're seeing now is really interesting to me, and that's that after the debate, as many people pointed out, Biden did a terrible job, and that just is what it is. And by the way, lots of people on the Democratic side came out and said, well, he was badly prepped, and all that may be true. He should. The buck stops at the top, right? That's his responsibility. He did a poor job at that debate. But what was really interesting to me was that poor performance became the story for the media, when in fact Trump had an equally poor performance and also refused to say that he would accept the results of the election, refused to answer any questions, lied for, almost everything he said was a lie. And that did not get the press. So that was actually really interesting, because I think what we're seeing here is a story that's created by the press, not to give Biden a pass, but it is certainly significant that Trump basically nobody called him out, or a few people did. I did. A few people called him out, but that the real public story became Biden. And exclusively, again, it's totally fair to cover him the way they did, but not exclusively. And as I say, in the first, I think it was 5 days after the debate, an independent journalist counted how many stories the New York Times had run, and they'd had 192 stories on Biden's performance in the debate, only 92 on Trump, and half of those covered the Supreme Court case that gave him immunity for criminal actions, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that actually raises a really interesting question. Why is the press? Well, first of all, why does it matter? It matters because if you think about policies, you can say, hey, I'm going to come in and I'm going to give everybody a swimming pool or whatever. I'm making this up. But what is politically possible is constrained by what people believe is possible, but by what people think. So that world of the press, which helps to produce the world of what people think, is enormously important. And the Republicans have understood this since the 1970s. In fact, they have developed a concept called the Overton window. And that Overton window is what is deliberately created by saying things that are more and more and more extreme, so that the media keeps moving that direction and people come to accept as possible and even desirable things that 10 years ago couldn't be even imagined. So, for example, I wrote last night about fetal personhood laws. They were an absolutely fringe concept until 2008, until 2008. It was kind of like, I just didn't even know what it was like. It was one of those things where people are like, oh, come on. Now, the Republican Party has put in their platform that they want these fetal personhood laws. And what that means is that a fertilized egg has the same rights as any human being. And that is deeply problematic for any number of reasons. Of course, it gets rid of abortion. It gets rid of IVF because you have to throw out fertilized eggs. It gets rid of a number of forms of contraception. But think about what it does to our laws. So, for example, what happens if somebody is pregnant and lifts a heavy weight, the laundry or something, and miscarries? Has that person then caused the death of another human being? I mean, this is like a can of worms like nobody can imagine, but it's very important to those Christian nationalists who believe in the idea that a fertilized egg is a human being and that anything that interferes with that is murder. So that idea, which was so fringe in 2008, is now in the Republican platform, which is crazy. Anyway, that's the whole idea of moving what people can think about. So when the press focuses exclusively on Biden's debate performance, and mind you, he has been out in public, I think it's 18 times since then. He's done live stuff, he's done interviews, you name it, he's done it. And they keep moving the goalposts. Well, you got to do more, you got to do more, you got to do more. And the question is why? Why are they doing that? And a lot of people are speculating that they are in the tank for Trump. Maybe. I mean, I don't know that. They are making the connection that a number of CEOs of those media corporations are supporting Trump. And again, maybe you'd have to look at their practices in the newsroom to see whether or not that's true. It could simply be that traditional media is in real trouble. They're hemorrhaging supporters. And mind you, there are more on the right that are hemorrhaging supporters than on the left. So people like Gateway Pundit, for example, is in real trouble compared to CNN, which is down significantly, but it's still down. And they want people to pay attention. They want clicks. They want people to read their stories. So if you looked last night, there was a story about the fact that a specialist in Parkinson's had gone 10 times to the White House over about, I think it was May of 2023 through March of 2024. And the implication was that they were going to visit to see if Biden had Parkinson's. And far down in the story, it said the same guy had been many more times than that in the past. And they kept pushing White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre on that yesterday. And to the point that she actually called it out and said, "You're disrespecting me," and knock it off. And the White House doctor, because the White House as a whole medical staff, actually issued a letter yesterday directed to her that said the person in who has come is a neurologist, and we have more than 1,000 people that we look after, many of whom are military veterans who have neurological issues, and this person comes to those. And then he went on to say, "I did release a neurological evaluation of President Biden in February." And here it is again. He does not have Parkinson's. And he goes through the whole thing. And it was just a really interesting moment because it felt as if the press wanted those clicks. They wanted the story. And that would get them the most clicks. And that has, though, I think hurt their credibility a lot, which is deeply problematic. We need our fourth estate very badly. I mean, without them, we're in deep crap. But it has created a situation where the Democratic Party has to respond. It has to at least acknowledge that this is the main story and how to counter that, how to deal with that. And there's been a ton of disinformation around that. You've asked me what would happen if they switch Biden out. I don't know. I don't know what the future would hold, and we're in a completely unprecedented time. I will tell you, in the past, challenges to an incumbent are deadly for a party that's in power. So, that track record doesn't look good. My own sense is that they are starting to pull together behind Biden again. That being said, one of the things that's really interesting about this press frenzy over Biden's performance is that Biden is actually very popular among the base. The media don't like him. They're unhappy about a number of things he's done. But the base really likes Biden. And they've been turning out and saying, hands off. You know, the people who are complaining in the press are overwhelmingly white and male. And the base, which is female and people of color, are saying, you know, cut it out. We understand that the man is working incredibly hard. And, you know, he was up against a guy who was deliberately engaging in gaslighting on that platform, which many of us have experienced, and we don't want him removed. We'll see. We'll see how that all plays out. I do think the other thing that's interesting is that a lot of people who did not previously have skin in the game are calling out the fact that the press is essentially saying, we're not interested in dealing with Trump, so we're just going to deal with Biden. So there was a big story today or yesterday in The Guardian by Maureen Sullivan, I think it was, who said, this is ridiculous. You know, go ahead and cover Biden. Same way I'm saying, cover Biden for sure, but how can you not pay attention to what is happening with Trump? And the answer to that was given by a newsroom person within the last few days, in which he said, you know, people on the right don't care. They don't click on stories about Trump. They say we're fake news and they don't pay any attention. The Democrats will still read those stories. So it gets you more attention if you write those stories. I'm an agnostic on that. It's certainly, from my experience, people actually like to know what's happening in the larger picture. But I think that all those factors mean it's an incredibly unsettled time. All right, so somebody's talking about polls. You asked about polls and how polls are conducted. I don't trust the polls anywhere any longer. And it's a problem because what you see is people on the right citing polls that support them and people on the left citing polls that support them. The polls, how they are written, really matters. I do know a little bit about internal polling, not for the DNC itself or the RNC, but for individual races. Those polls are much more accurate, and some of the ones that are internal are not at all what you're seeing in the external polls. Um, so I got nothing on the polls, because what's happened is polls are now being used to determine how people think rather than to see how people think. That is, they're skewing the samples, they're skewing the questions. The polling world is in a real mess right now. So I don't use polls about candidates myself. I do use them about issues, because political scientists, which I am not, will tell you that people answer their questions about their opinions honestly until it has become politicized by a political figure, and then they just back that person. So, for example, you will see that Republicans said that presidents should not be above the law until Trump was included, and then all of a sudden they said, yeah, presidents can be before the law, can be above the law. So that polls are really a mess. All right, so that was the first question you all asked. Let me go into then what about what Trump is doing? Really interesting there too. Lots of people have asked if Trump is trying to create a coup before the next election. And I think it is very obvious that he has absolutely no intention of saying, oh yeah, Biden won, no problem, I'm going to go home and golf. He definitely is intending to steal that election. But there's something really interesting about that too. His supporters have not turned out to create violence since he has been in office. So they turned up on January 6th for sure, but he said he would protect them and pay for lawyers, and then he didn't. And more than 1,000 of them have gone to jail. Many more are in legal trouble. And he has called repeatedly in the last year for his people, for example, to show up on the border for him. Ended up being 19 trucks, and they got diverted along the way to a religious meeting, and they were all angry about it. He's called for people to show up at his indictments. They did not. He called for people to show up at his trial, and he kept saying, this place is packed, you can't get in and all that. Absolutely not true. I mean, at one point, there's a reporter out there outside the trial, and there's 3 people who are out there for Trump, and they don't look like they're necessarily the most stable. So even though he is calling for it repeatedly, it's not at all clear that that's going to happen. What has been much more obvious is that Trump has not been trying to get voters. He deliberately said, I don't want Nikki Haley voters, whom he needs. That's 20% of the base of the Republicans who said they did not want Trump. He made no effort to reach out to them. He has instead put he doesn't have a ground game. If you look around, I don't think he's got a single office open in Pennsylvania. Biden's got, I don't know, well over a dozen, but Trump has no one. He's just not even trying to play a ground game. What he has done, and he hasn't been giving money to down ballot races. The money for the election is almost exclusively going to him. Much of it is going to his legal expenses. Don't forget that. What he has done is he has put his own hand-picked people into election offices around the country in Republican-dominated states, and he has invested very heavily in lawyers to challenge the outcome of the election. That's been something people like me have been watching very closely. Now, that being said, that changed about 5 days ago. In the midst of all this stuff about Biden being too old, Trump quite unexpectedly tried to say he was more moderate than everybody had thought. So rather than doubling down on his base and trying to stir him up to be violent, all of a sudden he pivoted. Now, he has sort of mentioned that in the past, but he pivoted really visibly on July 5th when he said that he didn't even know what Project 2025 was about. That, I'm sorry, I don't usually use profanity. That is, I can't use it because it might be recorded. Never mind. That's BS. I did the numbers today. He appears in Project 2025 more than 200 times. Many of the policies that it embraces, he has also embraced. The people who have written it are his people. They were in his previous White House. They would be in the next. They are literally the exact same people. But that Project 2025 calls for basically a dictator and a very strong president. There's a theory behind it I could explain. And with that very strong president, they would also get rid of the aspects of the American government they don't like. For example, on getting rid of the Department of Education, and they would get rid of all the civil servants and replace them with Trump loyalists. Make the Department of Justice answer not to the law but to Trump, and make the military answer not to the military rules and regulations but also to Trump. And I do want to once again reemphasize that the military, all the branches of the military, with the exception of Homeland Security, have a very long history of their own that they care deeply about honoring the Constitution. And certainly there are bad eggs in every carton. But, Mark Milley stood up to Donald Trump. And if you remember, after he did this is in June of 2020, after he did that, leaders of all the branches of the military said, we support the Constitution, not one man. I mean, it was unprecedented. It was really astonishing. Department of Homeland Security does not have that history because it is new. And there are a bunch of officials, law enforcement officers in the Department of Homeland Security. They were the ones that Trump tried to deploy in the summer of 2020, if you remember that. So all of those things are in Project 2025. And Trump has also claimed the ability to use, he says that basically the president has extreme power. So even though the Congress has said that it's going to fund, for example, a Department of Education, he can just say, screw you, I'm not going to do that. And the Department of Education will have no money and it will have to go away. Similarly, FBI, they've talked about defunding the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and so on. So he has talked about moderating. And interestingly enough, which is crap. I mean, he doesn't care. He just needs to be in power so he doesn't go to jail, right? So interestingly enough, yesterday when the Republican platform came out, it fudged some of the language on abortion, which is a really damaging issue for the Republican Party. And interestingly enough, the New York Times echoed that. They echoed that the Republicans under Trump were moderating on abortion, which is wrong. I mean, literally, the pro-abortion, the pro-life, Susan B. Anthony, pro-life, I don't remember, organization, there's one more word there, came out and said, oh yeah, we're going to use the 14th Amendment and congressional laws to establish a national abortion ban, national ban on IVF, national ban on contraception, and so on. And the Times didn't pick that up, which is really sort of eye-popping. So Trump, I think, is hoping to capitalize on these attacks on Biden by trying to look more moderate. Do not fall for it. He is not more moderate. All right, so now here are the things that didn't get covered because of the focus on Biden. And I told you I was going to scare the pants off you, and here I am going to do it. There were 3 major Supreme Court cases, but 2 I'm going to talk about at the very end of the Supreme Court session that are game-changing. The first is called Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, Gina Raimondo, who is the Secretary of Commerce. And what is shortened as Loper Bright means is that it overturned the long-standing practice, long-standing rule in the law, the long-standing law. That decision. It's never mind. I'm too deep in the weeds there. That a court, if somebody challenges a regulation, a court should presume that the agency is right. It should defer to the agency unless it is clearly out of whack, because agencies are staffed with experts. So, for example, if you have an issue about fisheries, which is what Loper Bright was about, or about OSHA, or about the Environmental Protection Agency, How do you know how many parts per million it's okay to have in of arsenic it's okay to have in a body of water? I don't. And so instead of saying to me, you choose, it said agencies would staff themselves with experts and they would decide. And those things can be challenged, but the presumption was that the agency was right. Loper Bright threw that out. It said that no longer should judges presume the agency knows what it's doing. Instead, the judges should decide. Immediately, what happened was that people who were trying to get rid of government regulations went to right-wing judges and started to get those regulations stopped. So, for example, within the first day of Loper Bright, company challenged overtime rules, so that the overtime rules that the Biden administration put in place were stopped. So, Biden had tried to protect overtime rights. The next thing they did, and I think this shows where it's going, one of the next ones that was challenged was a trucking company challenged if you remember, the Biden administration has gotten rid of non-compete documents not for people who have special information, but for regular workers. So, for example, non-compete documents were being used for fast food workers, for example. And what that does is it means that you can't go from one fast food place to another fast food place, which enables those fast food places to keep their workers' pay low, because you can't say, hey, I'm going somewhere else. They got rid of that. They said for truckers, in this particular case, they can be covered by non-compete clauses. So you can't go from one trucking company to another trucking company. I mean, that's pretty transparently an attempt to keep to put your finger on the scale for big business. But here's one of the other kickers to that is that you can never mind, I won't go into that one. So the other thing that it did, that it has done since Loper Bright, is it has stopped the Biden requirement that gender identity is protected under Title IX. So you can just see that what you're seeing is the attempt to get rid of the idea that experts at agencies will figure out the guidelines of our society, and instead hand them over to right-wing judges. Okay, so somebody asked me, other than Bush v. Gore in 2000, when else has the Supreme Court decided a presidential election? And the answer to that is never. That's why that was such a huge deal. And somebody else asked, when did the Supreme Court, or when did the courts become these arbiters who get to decide everything? And the answer to that is really interesting. And I think one of the most interesting things that I've learned in the last couple of years, and that is when the Republicans figured out, and these are Republicans at the time mostly who don't care about culture issues, or who don't care about Christianity. They might be Christians, but they don't want to impose Christian nationalism. What they really cared about was business regulation and taxes. But they recognized that the world that they were trying to put in place was not popular, that voters liked having regulations. They liked a social safety net. They liked infrastructure. They liked the protection of their civil rights. So what Republicans figured out is, first of all, that they had to stop people from voting. And then in 2007, Mitch McConnell becomes the Senate minority leader. And he recognizes that in order to stop legislation, all he has to do is to weaponize the filibuster. Now, in the past, remember, the filibuster is just a rule that says that senators never have to stop talking. It sounds fancier than that, but that's all it is. So in the past, that meant you literally had to stand up and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. So it was pretty rare. What we got after 2007 was the ability to stop all legislation. There's a bunch of changes that happened then, a little bit before as well. All legislation, unless you can get 60 votes in the Senate. That's really, really hard to do. And of course, you're going to need to have a landslide election in which Democrats can win 60 seats, which is really rare, especially in the low population states like Wyoming and so on. So what that did is it basically said Congress can't legislate anymore. So even if the majority of Americans want certain things, the Senate can stop them. All right, so if that's the case, who's going to make the law? Well, the answer to that was also in Mitch McConnell's hands when he became Senate Majority Leader. He packed the federal courts with people who thought like he did, right-wing people. And that's why he was so desperate to get to get Trump in office, for example, because he wasn't really very worried about Trump actually being able to accomplish anything because the Senate wasn't going to let anything pass. What he wanted was to make sure he had justices in place so that they could manufacture cases and take them to sympathetic judges who would then hand down the law that the radical right wanted. And that's what he got. So the kicker to that, though, of course, is that Trump got onto the court 3 people who believed in Christian nationalism. And this is how we have gotten to where we are now. And I gave you that setup because really the only piece of information that matters in the present, certainly Project 2025 is important. Certainly Biden's, whatever Biden's going to do is important. Certainly climate change is important, which I haven't even been able to write about. There's so much else going on. But the most important thing that has happened probably in our history since this country was founded was the Supreme Court's July 1st decision in Donald J. Trump versus the United States. What that said was that a president cannot be indicted or prosecuted for committing crimes as part of his official duties. That's head exploding. What that says is the president is above the law. And this entire country was founded after a century of debate about whether a king could be checked by the people. And what the Americans decided when they declared independence in July of 1776 was that, in fact, leaders must be bound by the same rules as everybody else. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That is, they can't be argued with. They're mathematical constants, that all men are created equal. That for the Supreme Court to say everybody's equal except the president, the most powerful person in the world, is a complete rejection of everything this country has stood for the last 248 years. And the fact that this is not cover news every single day is malpractice. It's just mind-boggling. So just to be clear, people have said to me, oh, there's a question for it right there. Well, so why doesn't Biden just take that out for a spin, right? But the court saw that coming. And they said, instead of saying, well, the president can do whatever he wants, we're going to just go sit on a beach. They said, because we are not clear yet on what an official act is, because nobody has ever made this decision before, we're the ones who get to decide what an official act is. Well, it's pretty clear that they're going to declare that things that Biden wants are not official acts, not part of his job, because, for example, they are insisting on having control over agencies, but they are going to side in favor of Trump, who is going to put in place the political policies that those 5 and 6 with John Roberts want. It is, I called it a coup the other day on somebody's TV show. This is head exploding. And the fact that it is not getting, as I say, top of the line coverage everywhere, every day, is deeply problematic and deeply disturbing, because I don't think that Americans understand. We've always lived under the rule of law. I don't think they understand what it will mean if we put in office a president who is unchecked by our laws, especially one who has given us a blueprint in which he has called, for example, for rounding up 11 million people in the United States and putting them in what are essentially concentration camps. Distinction here, a concentration camp concentrates people. A death camp does that deliberately to kill them. So there's a difference between those two. But concentration camps almost always are plagued by disease and the problems of overcrowding. And they almost always have very high death rates as well. Not always, but almost always. And I think we can see that this is of real concern. I will also point out, which the media is not covering, that Governor Abbott has already begun to build a camp on the border of Texas for the Texas military at this point. But I have given up believing that anything that they say is in good faith. There is already a camp being built in Texas, allegedly for the Texas military. But considering how hot under the collar people got about Jade Helm, which we now know was Russian disinformation, I can't believe that this is simply not being covered. All right. So, yes, and somebody just pointed out that concentration camps were an official act. And certainly in our own history, we have had the idea of cracking down on the media as an official act, of people who speak out against the president being considered treasonous. That was in 1798, and we haven't used those laws again, but Trump would do it. And it worries me terribly that people don't seem to think it could happen here. I was actually talking to somebody recently who said, well, I just don't want to get involved in politics. And I thought, well, you may not want to get involved in politics, but politics is going to get involved in you if you are not paying attention. All right. So a couple of things here about, I told you I was gonna scare you to death, and you should be scared to death. And many people are already reaching out to me about how they can protect themselves, where they should go, and so on. And I will tell you, it's not a bad idea to have a plan, but if Trump gets into office and hands America over to Russia, which is what he plans to do, I don't think any place is going to be safe. I mean, you might be safe from past statements against Trump. People like me, I don't expect will be safe. Certainly people who are LGBTQ+ have very deep reasons to be concerned. People who are planning to get pregnant or have any family members who are planning to get pregnant who will lose their ability to have abortion care in case of a miscarriage are in trouble. I mean, I could just go on down the list. So I hope you are frightened. But here's the hope part. And I want to be really clear that this is not me being like, oh, we can do this. What Trump wants to do is extraordinarily unpopular. What the Christian nationalists want to do is extraordinarily unpopular. Even at its height, a reactionary movement never gets more than about 32 to 33% of the people. Never. Now, in Trump's case, you can maybe add on 8% of the people, maybe even 10% of the people who are just racist and sexist, maybe. That still leaves about 8% of leeway of people who really don't like this, but maybe are not involved in it. And the Democrats, of course, will get at least 45% of the vote of people who are just solidly saying, I'm going to vote for, somebody said to me today, I'm going to vote for a fork, as long as it's got a D by its name. The question of those people in the middle do not like what Trump is offering. The job for us going forward here is to create a sense in the United States that we can do this the same way that France did, the same way that England just did, the same way that Poland did, the same way that Spain did a year ago. We can do this. We can take back our democracy. And somebody asked how do you overturn a bad Supreme Court decision? Lots of ways. So think about Plessy versus Ferguson. That got over in 1896, said segregation is fine. That waited almost a decade to get overturned. A century to get overturned, but it was overturned by a new Supreme Court. Before that, though, that same Supreme Court also said that income taxes were unconstitutional. A member of that same party said, oh, for God's sake, that's not true. And we got an amendment to the Constitution establishing that income taxes are constitutional. You can also pass laws. You can do all sorts of things to get rid of bad Supreme Court decisions. You can also say, we're just not going to honor them. Somebody asked me if Lincoln had simply not honored Dred Scott. No, that's actually not true. He did honor Dred Scott. Everything he did to work around it came through the war powers, which is why he was so desperate to get the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, because he was afraid that after the war was over, the Dred Scott would become the law of the land again. But there are many things that we can do. Crucial, though, is not to quit now, because if we quit now in protecting democracy, and by the way, this is not the Democrats. This is people who care about democracy. This is Democrats, this is Greens, this is Independents, this is Republicans who recognize that they have lost their party. This is anybody. It does not matter what your partisan affiliation is in this fight. It matters that you want to preserve American democracy, and you do not want to turn the United States of America over to a figure like Donald Trump, who will have the powers of somebody like Vladimir Putin, because that's what's on the table in this. And the way that you do that, first of all, people are saying, how do we get the Times to stop shilling for Trump? Mind you, they're also running other good stories as well. I don't know what's going on over there. Well, first of all, you can put pressure on them. But one of the things that jumps out to me in this whole media frenzy is that nobody's talking about all the independent people who are doing fabulous work and have huge numbers of followers. So there are voices out there, and you can amplify those voices. And you can figure out things that they say. And I'm talking about, and I hate to do this because I always leave people out, Laura Rosen does diplomatic history. Joyce White Vance and Lisa Rubin do legal stuff. I'm sorry, I said history. I should have said affairs for Laura Rosen. They do legal stuff. Judd Legum does investigative journalism. At the Tennessee Holler, somebody at the Tennessee Holler, I'm sorry, I'm bad at this, is covering corruption stories. The Texas Tribune is covering corruption in Texas. Jess Piper is covering corruption in Missouri. Popular Information is great, has great stuff every day. Lots of people are doing this. You can amplify their voices. They also are usually sourced the same way my stuff is. You're welcome to amplify me too, by the way. Everything I put on the internet is, people always ask me if they can quote it or share it. Absolutely. Go for it. One of the things that really jumps out to me is that circle that the legacy media has for moving debate is powerful. But between social media and all these alternative news sources now, there are other ways to get out information. And we're trusted because we're not paid by any of the people that are involved in the legacy media. That doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. We definitely make mistakes. But we're actually interested in educating and having an educated population. And we're doing the legwork. And that is an alternative source. And getting that word out there as much as you can about Project 2025, about Agenda 47, about the Republican Party platform, which I'm going to write about more soon, but also about the good stuff. The fact that NATO is celebrating its 75th anniversary, I did in April, and they're having a big to-do in Washington about that. I just interviewed Secretary of State Antony Blinken about that. I'm going to post that in the next day or so. It was fascinating. The fact that, as I wrote about tonight, that the 1,000 counties in the United States that were the most depressed. They were called the left behind countries because they were growing both with population and with money at less than half the rate of all of the average of all the other counties. They've grown at 5 times the rate under Biden that they did under Trump, and they've had this incredible recovery. I saw that, by the way, in the New York Times. Jim Tankersley wrote an article about it, but they've shown up in a few other places. There's also all kinds of good news out there. The stock market, and it's always dicey to say, oh, the stock market is huge, and that matters. But, it's hit record highs now for day after day after day. there's all sorts of jobs coming back and all sorts of exciting things, to the good stuff to talk about as well. And it's really important, I think, to flood the zone with democracy, to flood the zone with the good stuff, to flood the zone with the danger that people like Trump present, because we know that Russia and Iran and China, and to some degree China and Iran are flooding the zone with the attempt to tear us apart. We need to flood the zone with all the stuff that's going right, because that's the reality. It doesn't have to be just the good stuff. It's fine to say, I don't think that the Biden administration is doing enough on whatever. That's fine. You just need to flood the zone with reality, with what is really happening. And the other thing that I think is going to be really important is for everybody to reach for what they do best, and to create, to not simply to give in to what Trump is arguing is a hellscape. He's really pushing this American carnage theme, that everything is terrible in the United States and he's the only one who can fix it. In fact, things are pretty good in the United States. They're good economically. They're good in terms of all the creative indicators that we look for: music and art and the different voices and different languages and different colors and different people doing stuff. All that stuff is actually really solid in the United States. So whatever you're best at, whatever you're good at, do it. And it doesn't have to be political. I mean, although it's great if that's part of it, but be out there, convince people that this community, that democracy works, that we're in it together. And, that's one of the things that I've noticed as I've crossed the country again and again and again. People are terrified, and they should be terrified, but there are so many of us, millions, literally millions of us, that are out there trying to build something better. And here's the kicker: we're really decent people. I mean, if you've ever come to one of my events, people are chatting in the lines, and I always say, you would have each other over for dinner. You would not have Marjorie Taylor Greene over for dinner. And that's, I think, what we really must reinforce among ourselves as a movement, rather than focusing just on the people who are trying to, play some kind of inside baseball. Because at the end of the day, listen, I as you know, I've said this again and again and again. I was not a Biden supporter. I have become one. I think he has been one of the best presidents in our history. But to me, I hate to say it this way, he's just a president. That is, presidents come and go, and some are good and some are bad, and they make different changes and all that, and you might like it or you might not. But what has endured for almost 250 years is the American people. And we're the ones that those people work for. And somehow this idea that we're frightened of a tin pot con man who indeed has gotten the law of the land to say he doesn't have to answer to us certainly that's problematic, but there are 331, almost 332 million people in this country. And it's high time that we made it clear that this is our country, not those very few neo-Nazis and those very few Christian nationalists who are increasingly coming out of the closet. Josh Hawley said within a couple of days that, in fact, he's a Christian nationalist. And what that means is they want to, they see the nation as being a Christian nation, want to impose Christian law on everybody, which is, of course, completely antithetical to this country, but they are arguing that that's the case. There's another branch of that actually wants to not to say Christian law, but rather biblical law should apply to the United States, which is, to me, is just the Taliban with a different flavor, which is crazy to think that they're going to put it in the United States of America, but it's there. And we must not let that happen. And to be clear, I am 1,000% not advocating any kind of violence, aside from my own personal beliefs, which are nonviolent. We know historically that anytime violence gets involved in a movement, people turn against it. Because what Americans like is moderation. They have always liked moderation. Nobody wants to hear that if you've got a cause that you care deeply about. Americans are straight down the middle for the most part, as a group. And the minute that somebody turns violent in the United States, everybody turns against them. So the job that we have in the next 4 months, I kept saying 5 months last week, somebody said it's 4, is to take back the symbols of America. Take back the flag, fly your flag, wear a flag pin, talk about American democracy. And if it ends up being Biden at the top of the ticket, which is kind of what I expect, great. He's done great stuff. If it ends up being somebody else, fine. I don't care. Because at the end of the day, this is about us and our country. And it is high time we woke up and recognized that that was the case. Now, a lot of people are like, oh man, it's easy for you to say that, how is it, we're up against so much stuff. Literally, Americans did this in the 1850s when they took back the government from the elite enslavers who had monopolized it, including the Supreme Court and the presidency. They did it in the 1890s when big business had taken over the Congress, essentially, and were making all the laws for themselves. They did it in the 1930s. If you had been in the United States in September of 1929, you would have been like, the Republicans are going to run everything forever because they have everything. They have the House, they have the Senate, they have the presidency, they have the Supreme Court. They've got everything sewn up. By 2 months later, the crash had happened and everybody had begun to turn on the Republicans. FDR in 1932 wins by a landslide and changes the entire country. We are looking at something that looks very much like that. We are looking at a period when a corrupt Supreme Court has declared the president is above the law. That is, I just don't even have, I didn't sleep that night, not out of fear for myself or anything, but out of heartbreak for a country that I care so deeply about, that somebody would throw that out. They would throw out the rule of law. I am furious in addition to being heartbroken. And we all need to get furious and say, by God, this is not our country. We can worry about what comes next if Trump wins in November. We still have a few months then if that happens. It's going to be a tight election, folks. But we do know that nobody who hears about Project 2025, or almost nobody who hears about Project 2025, actually wants it. They don't want a president who can do whatever he wants. They want those things to be reined in. Our job is to say, our America doesn't look like that going forward. So I hope you keep the faith, because I'm going to keep the faith, and do everything you can. Bring out your skills. Make people proud to be American again, because by God, this country's pretty special. Thank you for being here. And I will be back next week. Once again, I am going to start doing shorts. I got all my equipment. I've even got a teleprompter, which, considering I'm still wearing a bathing suit from what I was doing before I came here, is kind of astonishing. I have a little teleprompter. I'm ready to go. I'll do everything I can to make it easier for people to get the message out. And I'm about to go on radio stations. This is our big push, folks. This is our time. This is our job to save American democracy the same way that our parents and grandparents did. And let's just do it. So I will see you. I'll be out and around. I'll be back next week, and we'll make this happen. Thanks for being here.